I'm ready to go. Good morning, everybody. I would just like to say, first of all, I hope you don't get distracted because I back onto a school, and about 5 minutes ago they started mowing their lawn, so it's been quite noisy. I don't know if they're finished, but it stopped, just stopped. So I hope it stays that way. Okay, I'm going to talk today about adolescence, and the contents of what I'm going to talk about is giving a sort of a theoretical background on adolescence, and then to talk about how we can shape teenagers' behavior patterns, and the influences that will have on their behavior. Can we move on to the contents page, please? And then at the end, we'll have some recommended reading for you. So I'll start with adolescence. So if we go on to the next slide on adolescence, please. So adolescence, as an introduction, really just to introduce the factors, there are 5 leading characteristics of adolescence. It's biological growth and development, undefined status, increased decision making. It's a period when they have to start thinking about making some decision and choices, and therefore with that increased pressures. And towards the end of their adolescent period, it's they start searching for who they are, a search for self. And most research has shown over the years that given all this going on in that period, that short period, it's they describe it as a period of turmoil and stress. So in the literature, you'll read a lot about turmoil and stress for adolescents, but I like to actually promote it as a period of opportunity. It's an opportunity for parents to actually see this as a transitional period. And during that transitional period, the emphasis is are on things like education, training, employment or unemployment, and possible even living circumstances. So things that happen during their teenage years that most of it are beyond their control. But I think what we have to really recognize is that there are multiple transitions involved during that childhood period. And so I like to call it a period of, I like to think of it as a time, I use the example of crossing a bridge. So we're moving them from childhood to adulthood. And there is that, what we call that undefined bit in the middle, which is adolescence. And that's where they're at, really. And so therefore, during that period, because they need a lot of nurturing, there can be an awful lot of influences that will impact on their lives. I know some of you may have girls and boys in the family. I'm going to just talk about the developmental. It's a huge developmental period for boys and girls. And one of the biggest things that we notice is the gender differences that occur during that period. It's girls start puberty or hormonal growth quite earlier on, probably about 8. And they have a growth spurt that's quite rapid from about age 10, with things like breasts, height, menstruation, etc. Increased body fat. Well, boys start a bit later, but they also end later. And the things that happen with boys is that they have the same sort of growth. They have like genital growth, height and muscle mass. But the difference is, there are some differences. Boys tend to have their larynxes, their pharynx, their lungs, these sort of things grow a bit more, and therefore that's why you get that vocal quality, that change when we say they lose their voice, which does not happen with girls. In fact, our voices change throughout our lifetime and a longitudinal way, and even during menopause before it actually changes even deeper. And so other things like the heart sizes grow to double its capacity, the lung sizes grow, blood volume is increased. All these things are going on in boys that are not so much in girls. And I think that this is something to always remember when you are having to deal with young people in general, boys and girls, is that there are these gender differences. And if you are a parent, they could be quite difficult to manage. But what I want to stress is it's a time when there is that bright spotlight for both groups on body image. And that is what, because of all these changes, the bodies, the images of the young people, because they change physically, you have the early bloomers, you have the late bloomers, you have the pressures, and you can have bullying. And during this period, I've already talked about all that they're going through, but then you have the added things like bullying going on. And these things can have a huge psychological effect on young people. So the challenge for parents is great. It's such a great challenge to try and manage all these things for young people. I remember, I think the headmaster said there were some people from Australia, and it just reminded me of a footage that was shown of a young boy in a car with his mother, picked him up from school, and he was experiencing dwarfism, and I think he had been bullied in school quite a bit, but actually it seemed like he hadn't been telling his mum for a while, because it was so sad to watch how body images and things like that can make such a vast difference for young people at that age. It's an important period in their lives, and a lot of bullying and so on can go on, but they're not quite, because one of the other areas that's not as visual is brain development and brain growth. And because they're not quite there yet with the growth of the brain development, they're not cognitively or even emotionally able to deal and manage with things like bullying, as for example, or some of the other issues that are going on for them. So there are a lot of influences that have on our young people. But this is a phase, this is a period when we should see this as an opportunity to nurture that development, to nurture positive relationships between ourselves and our young people. And it is, while all this is going on, we have to think about how we can use that time to develop the learning experience, because it's considered one of the most important things is to help them to develop attributes through learning and experience, so that they can learn how to learn things for the future. One of the areas that, for example, what I mean by that is, when I think about how do we manage our children's behavior patterns, one of the things that we all know that we have to do, no, we haven't changed slides yet, we're still on time, is that they are actually, this is an example of how we need to think about how we manage our young children's behavior at the time, and to help them to learn through their experience. Often, one of the problems we have with our young people are things like staying up late on the Nintendo or PlayStation or whatever it is, phone. We have that problem. One of the most important things that they need is sleep. Because we know that with sleep, if they get their sleep, they can actually concentrate and focus a lot better. So one of the ways that I always try to help parents to think about how to manage things like this is to help them through their experience. Not just to say, if you give them the script, if you give them the dialogue, whatever, we tend to give it in quite a way that we demand, go to bed and so on. And actually, it doesn't really work. One of the best ways to work is to use their experience. So I give the example, for example, if they go out, as they're teenagers, we're talking about secondary school, they're teenagers, we allow them to go out and have a late night on a Saturday night, probably a bit later than they usually would. We're not talking about all night, but just a bit later at a friend's party. On a Sunday morning, they can't wake up because they have a lie-in, but that's okay, because we let them have that lie-in. We say it's okay to have that lie-in, but use that experience on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday to say, but you see how you felt on Sunday morning? You couldn't do a full day's focusing. So if we start a bit earlier, if you go to bed a bit earlier, maybe we cut back on some of the things and you can have a longer time at weekends and so on. But help them to really appreciate through their experience what it's like to actually, what we're trying to get them to do, which is to sleep. But because of that experience of not being able to function, it helps better than just telling them you've got to go to bed early. Okay, if we go on to the next slide. The factors that shape young people's behaviours. So you want to go on to the next slide, please? And there are a number of factors. I mean, I've already talked about the messages, that what I just gave as an emotional message, an example of a message that you can give to young people, and how you can use effective discipline rather than ineffective discipline to help young people. But one of the areas that we don't really give much to is genetic makeup. Now, we know that when you are, you've got two blonde-haired parents, they're more likely to have a blonde-haired child. We've got two brown-eyed parents, they're more likely to have a brown-eyed child. But also, one of the things that we inherit as well is temperament. And that's not something that's actually focused on an awful lot. So if you don't want your children to have your temperament, you've got to nurture the way that they think in a different way. But I mean, it's all combined. There are a lot of neurological reasons why teenagers behave the way they do. It's not just the nurturing. So I wanted to just explain that there are the development through both sides. And one of the ways, one of the most important ways, and one of the things that I want to stress heavily throughout this session, that we can help our children is through modeling. And what we model to our children, we model discipline, we model messages, we model an awful lot, then that's how we help our young people a lot. And so you actually have to, I mean, I do actually smile sometimes when I'm out and trying to go to the train stations, and I usually have to pass a primary school. There's a primary school, and we have two sets of traffic lights that we cross, and you see the parents with the young children telling their young children, wait for the green man before we cross. And then five or six adults just zoom across and the light's red, and they zoom across. And I look at the children often. I try to stand there myself and wait for the green man, because I then look at the children and I think to myself, in 10 years' time, they're going to zoom across the road. And if you think that's what we model to our children, the influences are not just from us, also from our environment. So all these other expectations that we have, that the schools have, that parents have, can also be affected by the environmental influences that are there in our environment, and also the influences of friends and peers. Most secondary school children are given a key and are told that they can go and make their own way home. What do you think happens when they're on the bus? They get conversation with other youngsters, and if it's not somebody who is going to be giving them brilliant ideas, it might have a huge impact on them. But one thing that actually people don't also take too much of is watching others. And this is where, again, modeling from our environment, from us as parents, watching others. And I always use I use a personal example here, because my son likes fishing. He saw a man fishing when he was 8 years old, and on the way home, he nagged me to get him a fishing net and a fishing rod, which were quite expensive. And then over the years, it got more and more expensive and so on. But what that helped me with was somewhere for him to go, with something that he was focused on, that he enjoyed. And that meant that I could then have something to sort of leverage with, to say, you know, if you do your homework, you finish your homework in time during the week, on Saturday, you can have all day at the lake fishing, and things like that, and whatever other influences. But one of the most important things about really observing the influences and observing your child's interests and what they're really interested in, and what their intentions are, and what they're like, and not to really stifle whatever because when he told me fishing, I thought, oh my God, that's so boring and dull. I mean, I still think it's boring and dull, but you know, he loves it. Because we're now in a lockdown. What I noticed recently was we're in a lockdown. And when we were in the lockdown, if one of the first things that Boris Johnson allowed them to do was to go fishing, He just went off, and it was, I mean, he's now in his 30s. And whereas we are all struggling with our mental health, he's happy. And that's something that was nurtured from he was the age of 7. And I think that what we have to do is just find a nugget, find something that our young children are really interested in, and run with it. And you know, if it's stamp collecting, fine. Whatever it is, try and give that, because that will help them to nurture them, to learn discipline, to learn focusing, and it would help with the academics as well. So media and technology, well, I say very little on that because my colleague is going to talk about that. But again, media and technology, I also like to mention the value of it to parents, because I think my colleague would talk about all the things that are probably right or wrong with it, but I like to focus on the positive. And there is a huge positive on media and technology for our children. And I will just give a brief example. For me, when you think about what David Attenborough has brought into our living rooms, which is the videos that he has shown about the plastic, for example, in the seas and in our oceans. And now we have to buy bags. Look at the impact it's had on our world because of the number of people that have been able to see it. So I think that I think sometimes we need to also understand and appreciate that there is a positive about media and technology, and it would be useful for our children to actually be able to use this facility. And one way of dealing with facilities like this, as well as all the other things, the disciplines and everything else, is, for example, through monitoring, which is on the next slide. Monitoring is a tricky one because you can have positive monitoring and you can have all sorts of this tricky monitoring. But we as parents have an expectation for our young people, and we like to take action to try and keep track of our young people. But the way that we do it is important, okay? So, I mean, you, again, try to help them with their experiences, use their experiences to help them to learn what you're trying to give them, what you're trying to do with them in order to discipline them. So there is a shift in culture at the moment about how and where children, I remember that, you know, we would be, my mum would be quite excited on a Saturday morning because I was always quite excited to go to Top Rank Club. I mean, we're talking about the 70s here and 60s. I know that's quite a long time ago, but that was about it. Whereas now they go to raves and it can go on all night. So monitoring has the change in culture, the change in shift in things can make these sort of types of strategies for managing our children very difficult. But we have media and technology which can be used in a positive way to manage things like that as well. But we need to be very clear in order to manage our expectations. We need to be very clear with our communication and our expectations. Be reasonable in your expectation. It's quite interesting actually, because on Wednesday we did one of our technology talks in the school, and one of the things that we talked about with the modelling of technology, one of the young men in the group, I don't know, probably about 10 or 11, but we talked about, he said, parents' expectations, they expect us not to be on the computer all the time. But my mum, when we were on holiday, she was checking emails all the time. What are you modelling? What was she modelling? And look at how much he took that on board. He took that on board, and that was important to him. And I think we've got to be very careful with how we model things. And when we're monitoring, that we be reasonable in our monitoring with our young people. I know a lot of things we do unconsciously, but you know, we have an expectation as parents. We really think about, are we expecting too much? And we really need to think about how what our actions are. And one of the things that we must remember, yes, we talk and listen, we take track of their intentions and track of everything they do, but choose your battles. Choose your battles. Not all your battles gonna have to be about everything that they do. So for example, what I mean by that, if a parent has asked a young man to, or a young boy to take the dustbin out, and he goes and he picks it up and he starts to throw things, and then he throws it in the bin and he slams it in, and then he says, makes comments, I hate doing this, and I hate my mum, and ignore the comments, because he's actually doing what you asked him to do. And that's what you asked him to do, was to put the things in the bin. He's done it. Later on, when everybody is calmer, you can actually, when you're sitting down in a calmer time, you can say, you know, when I asked you to put the bins out earlier, yesterday, whatever, some of the things you said weren't very nice, were they? What do you think? You know, have a talk, have a conversation, and share that with them. It makes such a difference to just having a go at them about, now, why are you slamming the door? Now, you shouldn't be slamming the door, because then you've changed the process of the discipline you're trying to instill. And always follow through with your consequences, whatever those consequences are. So the way that parents respond, the way that you take your action, and you know, is very important, but your expectations must also be reasonable. Okay, next slide, please. So what we're trying to do is to build good relations between our relationships between our young people, and between ourselves and them, and our young people. And one of the things we don't want to do is to start making the discipline affect how we manage our children's behavior. So what I mean by that is that when we talk about accidental rewards, if you reward a child because you want a quiet life, for example, you're digging a massive hole for yourself, because you're going to get a quiet life for that minute, but not for the rest of it. You give them an ice cream today, they're going to want one for the rest of their lives, or whatever. And with that kind of attention that you've given them, the child has taken power and control. So be very, very, very careful with how you reward a behavior, and make sure it's not a misbehavior, because what can happen is you can get into a cycle of undesirable behavior patterns, which we call escalation traps. So you trap yourself into a situation where, for example, you find yourself having to always shout at your child. You end up that you get, your voice escalates with how many times you have to ask them to do something. And what will happen is that in the long run, they will wait until your voice gets to that volume before they do it, because that's the only time that there is some sort of movement. So you are going to constantly have to keep doing that. You don't want to keep doing that as a parent. That is really, really difficult for you as a parent. So be careful with the traps that we fall into. And as I say, don't be surprised if they wait till you yell next time, which is what happens to most of us. Communicating with our young people. Be yourself. You know, that's the important thing about working with young people. Mirroring, as I say, imitating, modeling, all these sorts of things. How you behave, how you sit, how you do all sorts of things. How you speak helps. Children can mirror our behavior. One of the things that I always use in parenting groups that I run is I always try to help parents to see, I always ask the question, why does a young person who lives in Liverpool speak with a Scouse accent? Why does a Chinese child speak Chinese and not English? Because they imitate us. Because they are actually what we model, they're picking up, not just from the environment, but from us as well, an awful lot. And so they tend to mirror a lot of the things that we do, mirror our behavior and our behavior patterns, whether it's verbal, non-verbal, sounds, tone of voice, way we speak, you cross your legs, whatever, they tend to mirror our behavior. And so our society as a whole strives on very strong families. So share those valuable interests, share those modeling. If you model all these different interests to children and you communicate, you build that strength in your family. And so provide the opportunities to engage, for engaging activities with our young people, to build strong families. And one of the ways that I always try to help people to do that is to say, give I messages rather than you messages. And what I mean by that is when a child is doing something that you're not particularly keen on, I mean, a lot of us will say, you did this, you did this. Actually, it's actually much more effective if you then, I would like you to speak quietly. I would prefer that you put you don't slam, or you didn't slam the dustbin lid. I would prefer. Your building is respect, because you're telling them to respect your opinion, your view. And I go back to what I said earlier on about your building relationships with young people and what our expectations are. Well, we also want them to respect in such a way that they will appreciate the family rules and what the family mean, what being in a family mean. So talking, listening, sharing views, spending time together, all very, very, very important, because strong families spend time together, and you're spending time together with your young people. I work with in a secondary school most of the time, and I'm amazed by how many, next slide please, how many young people tell me that their parents don't spend an awful lot of time. And I'm talking about 16, 17-year-olds as well, that they actually struggle, that their parents still don't spend an awful lot of time with them. Somehow we feel that because they're older and they can make their own choices. Yes, they can, but they still need our time. It'll be less, but it'll be more meaningful time, because they can communicate with us and they can exchange ideas with us. So it'll be a more powerful time, but we still need to give them that time. So plan time for family meetings and outings and opportunities to discuss your beliefs and expectations, to share views, an opportunity to set family goals, to deal with things like what might be going on in the family with illnesses or whatever, and none so more than now, where we have this lockdown period. And when we do things like family meetings, also give them the opportunity to speak, because I did a talk in one of the other schools, and I asked among the young people whether they have family meetings, and one girl put her hand up and she said, yes, we do, but dad arranges it and he says everything and he sets the agenda and he says, oh, we can't say anything. I said, woo, because you've got to give them, how are you going to learn about your child's abilities, about what your child's views are, about what whether they understand your expectation, whether they're following your expectations. We need to help them to be able to share their views with us, and that's something that's really important. So encourage all family members to participate in whatever you've set up, but share the views and create that opportunity for family to set related goals. And one of the things that I was asked to add was about dealing with sibling issues, which is on the next slide. And just as you can see here, it basically is, on the next slide, please, you've got, if you can read that, you've got what I've put there is, as an example of managing behaviour pattern in the home, is if you've got something like normal bickering, minor things going on, you're silly, get out of here, then the parent's role is to start teaching them, to start helping them to manage things. If it's simple, help them to deal with it by staying out of it and let them deal with it. If it gets a little bit more where the volume is growing up and you get nasty name calling and mild physical contacts, get off, no, nothing, go away. And there's a little bit of a threat there, then try and acknowledge with the young person that they're angry and reflect on each child's point of view, okay? But of course, if it gets a little bit more serious, when the things start to get a bit more serious and then you get into the orange, where there's potential danger and things are getting a bit more serious, where you see it's half play, but then they're really trying to fight harder, and you've got to step in. So what I'm saying is sometimes you can let things work and let them learn to manage through experience, manage things themselves. And eventually, after you've gone through the red light, it comes right back up to the green light the next time. So what you're doing is you're teaching them so that the next time they will know that they can try and deal with it themselves. So by the red light, where it becomes very dangerous, you want to actually, if it's going to think it's harm, then you have to firmly stop. You step in, you separate them, and you deal with things, and possibly issue a consequence if it was a particularly serious situation. It may not necessarily be fighting, but it could be a serious situation. So this is an example of how we would help parents to manage behavior. And we just focused on the sibling as an example, but this can happen in all the different parts of conflicts that happen in relationships with children in the home. One of the, next slide please, one of the another way of managing and helping to nurture young people is to help them to develop a sense of routine and how to routinely do things. And this is really important for children in the classroom and in schools and so on, to develop that routine to be able to manage themselves. And we do that as parents by developing family routines. The pattern will transfer elsewhere. So if you have a routine in the family and they know what they should do, they know where they're at, it's easier for them to follow your rules or what you have, your daily, whatever the daily rules are, whatever the daily routines are. If they know that there's that pattern, there's the pattern of bedtimes, there's the pattern of meal times. You know, young people say, well, a young boy said to me the other day, he gets hungry, so he has a sandwich when he gets home because dinner is not till 6. Well, that's the family routine, it's 6 o'clock. And his mum allows him to have a quick sandwich because he will be hungry, but he can't wait till 6 o'clock. That's fine. The family routine is 6 o'clock dinner, and he knows that. So he abides by that, okay? Housework, all these sorts of things. If you've got the pattern for them to be helping with washing and, I don't know, putting the bins out, it'll be okay. But it's that developing that sense of self will come later on, but you're starting that process and helping them to be able to manage themselves later on. It also helps your child to create what we call a body clock. And that body clock is that schedule that we have, as we know, as parents, because that's something that also bonds families together, so that you don't have that power struggle. So they know if you have that routine as well, you don't end up with this big power struggle where you then in the family where you have to fight over things. So you would have shared beliefs, shared routines, shared patterns, eating Sunday dinner together, all these sorts of things. So routines are really, really important to help you for helping with your children, your young people, because it does establish really, really healthy patterns and self-discipline. Okay, it's never too late to start these. A lot of you may probably think that we're talking about really young children. I'm not. I'm talking about teenagers as well, because it helps you to remember important things, but it also helps them to remember important things as well, because remember, they've shifted now from you picking them up from school to them managing their own way to school. So there's the new skills that they're developing. So we still have to do that nurturing in a similar way. And as I always try and stress, the importance of flexibility. Try to maintain that flexibility as much as possible. It's not about giving in. It's about trying to help them to develop a sense that sometimes things aren't going to always go the way they should. So you have to sometimes be a little bit flexible. And we model these things to our children by doing this when they are in this transitional period going across the bridge into adulthood. Okay, let's have a look at the next slide, please, quickly. So things like influences outside the home, and I talked about that earlier, peers and friends and school and media and technology, they have massive influence. But I want to just link this right now with why this is so important about dealing with risky behaviors, why these things are so important. And it is important because during the teen years, there's an intense brain development changes going on. Developmental changes. There's a part of the brain that deals with risk, and that part doesn't kick in until between the ages of about 14 to 16. That part of the brain it grows in mid-adolescence. So when you are having difficulty with your child, struggling with self-control, that part of the brain hasn't fully developed yet. And so as parents, it is one of the main parts of nurturing that we have to do is around this area, this part of their lives, because they are soaking in a lot of information about things like taking risks and developing self-control so that they can better be able to assess cause and effect. Because at this is the stage when they are able to make those, to learn how to do that. And so the brain becomes more involved in things at that time, like emotions and dealing with interpreting other people's emotions. And we've got to also help them to do that. If we shout at them and yell at them and so on, we're not helping them to nurture that managing emotions that easily. And during that there's a place in that period for us as parents to nurture this. And I can't stress how important this is enough for our parents to remember that these are the years when we actually would say, well, we told you how to do this, we told you how, but actually they're going through a different phase. So when I talked about the right at the beginning, I talked about all that's going on for them. Right now, there is also this brain development, that's the brain growth that's happening, and it's giving them a chance to do a bit more learning. So therefore, as parents, we need to help them to better interpret things like emotions and interpret other people's, how people behave. And there's some education that's needed there so that if they can interpret these things, then they can interpret risky behaviors a little bit better, risky situations, to avoid them if possible from escaping those that should be avoided. Because a lot of parents will say that during this period they find friends and they might magnetically drawn to the bad boys, or because they're trying to actually make sense of what to do, what's and although they know what's right or wrong, it might be that, well, is it that bad, you know? And also I talked about the modeling of the email earlier on. Is it that bad? So we want to have some help them to make risk reduction, develop risk reduction strategies. And modeling, as I said earlier on, comes into play here. But one of the things that I want to stress, though, is that the majority of young people, and I know that I try to put a positive spin on things and people always say that to me, but the majority, if you look at the statistics, the majority of young people do not get into trouble. There are millions of young people and there are thousands that probably get into trouble. So the majority, if you nurture, so that means a lot of parents are doing a really good job. So pat yourselves on the back, you're doing a really good job, and really stick to that, because a lot of young people, what we want to do is to nurture during this period for those that may become influenced by, I don't know, the drugs and alcohol, the cigarette smoking or whatever. And, you know, if you've nurtured them, I always think of it as a why, you've nurtured them. That is the strength of your nurturing, so that at the time they go the right way and not the left way. So they can make choices. And even if they start to go that way, they will probably have a rethink because of all the nurturing you've done. And you've got that foundation nurturing that's there. So it's really important to help by being consistent and help them with all sorts of as I say, other outside influences to help them to learn, to develop their newly acquired reasoning skills. That's when during that period, that's what they're doing. Okay, so when they're in that phase, try not to be correcting too much. Talk, listen, and offer optional ideas. Okay, if you just keep telling them what to do, they're going to go with the other friends. But if you offer optional ideas, you're giving them the opportunity to think. And then you may give them 2 ideas and they may take 1, but at least you're giving them the opportunity to think. And that is what drives us, is our thinking skills drives us throughout our lives. Okay, next slide. So I just want you to take 2 minutes, just 2 minutes, just as yourself. We're not going to share anything. Just as parents, I'm going to give you 2 minutes just to think like scientists, I call it. I want you to just have a minute to think about an issue that your child may be experiencing. What's the problem? what are the child's strengths? Strengths is spelled wrongly there, but never mind. What are the child's strengths? And what's your goal? What's your goal? And I'm going to just pause for 2 minutes. I want you to just have a think about that. Something that's going on in your household at the moment. What is that problem? What is your child's strengths? And I want you to think of your goal. And then I'll just feedback in a minute. But I want you to just have a little think about that as an exercise as parents for a minute or two. Okay, so I'm just wondering, I hope that has given you an opportunity to just yourself to think about how you could probably even use your child's strengths to help to resolve the problem. So thinking like scientists, that's how it works. Your child, for example, their strength, they have a hobby that they're really, really good at, and you want them to do their schoolwork because that's where the problem is. And it's useful to think about how you could use those two to work together to help your child's problem. What have I noticed about my child? He's good at maths, he likes tennis, but he's not so good at English. Yeah? What could I do to actually help him? Well, the biggest thing is encourage the positives. You really, really find something that is similar to whatever it is that they're good at, and help them to see that there is an end point that could be great about what they can do. And it may not be as good as what their hobby is, but encourage them to keep going so that they could see the positive side of it. That just as you can do that, you might not be as good at that, but the other thing, but you'll be able to do it. So I can see, as an example, I mean, a lot of people line up with Usain Bolt to run in a race, but not many of them know that they can beat him in a race, but they still get the encouragement from their coaches to go out there, because you never know, you might do. Okay, so always encourage young people to do the best they can. Not necessarily the greatest, the best, but use the things that they're really good at to help them to see and get that experience, that feeling of how things can go well. And that's what that's about. So if they like something, for example, if they're very good at something like football, you would find a club for them, wouldn't you, to actually go and play football regularly. If they're very good at maths, if they're not so good at maths, you'll probably find somewhere for them to go and help them to nurture the maths on a Saturday lesson or something like that. Okay, so it's about you thinking about what is your goal as a parent. It's got to be reasonable, it's got to be manageable, and it's got to be achievable. Not something that's just going to be because he has to do well. It's because he has to do the best he can. And that's what's really important. So just to end, what I'd like to just, the end thought, the next slide, please. We need to think about things that could keep our children happy. And the key is happy. We want children to be motivated to do things. If we keep them happy, we keep their motivation going. So, as I said just now, by helping the child to experience what it's like to achieve an end goal, we know that that would make them happy, and that would help them and not let them slump into, I can't do this, I can do, but I can do the best I can. Help them by sharing your interest with them, their interest. If it's the same, you can go cycling with them, or they can go cycling with uncle, whatever it is. Stamp collecting, as I say, it doesn't matter. Fishing, as in my son's point of view, I encouraged him, even though I didn't go with him, and I don't know anything to this day about fishing, but he loved it, and he still loves it. So encourage things that would keep them positive. Great sense of humor. Try not to be too obvious about things. I have to say, though, I want to stress at this point, just going back a little bit, a lot of parents tend to want to focus on the academics all the time, and I think that is quite stressful for young people. We need to balance it quite a bit with our young people. So when what I mean by that is, I do hear a lot of kids saying to me that when they're watching, I don't know, they're downstairs or whatever, mum says to them, go up and do your homework, or if they're not doing their homework, go and read a book, or something like that. If they're good readers and they like reading, that's fine. But sometimes they may need to do something else, because, as I say, watching the television can also education. Wanting to communicate, listen, talk, right? Have a good sense of humor. Choose your battles. Choose your battles, because that's what parents get into, an awful lot of battles. And that actually causes an awful lot of problems in families. Always show an understanding of where they're at. Show an understanding through empathy. And try and do a lot of things alongside your kids as much as possible. But most importantly, maintain a full fridge. That's very, very important, because you want to stay well and get your child to be happy. Maintain a full fridge all the time, because that's what they like. Okay, so that's it really, and I think what I want to do is just to suggest some books that you can acquire to read. I think for me, one of the best ones is The Teen Years Explained, because what that does is it not only gives you thoughts on behaviour management, it also talks about all the developmental stages, of which I just barely covered today. And those stages about the brain development, about all the things about drugs and alcohol, about managing all these things and monitoring and all these sorts of things, is in that book. So it's really, really helpful. Parenting teenagers, how to talk and listen. That's another so important thing, is about how we talk to our young people, what we say and how we say it, and things like that. So these are very, very good books. The Power of Habit, Between Parent and Children. And I think that if you can get hold of any of them, it would be really, really helpful. So I think it's now time for question and answer. Thank you.
How do I appear? Thank you, Jenny. That was wonderful. I love the bit about the full fridge. So that was great. Just to say, we have a few minutes now for some questions. So if people would like to ask questions, please submit them through the chat option or the Q&A option. So we have a question on whether you have any helpful ideas for getting out of escalation traps.
Yes, I mean, the getting out of it, they're obviously
Yes.
in escalation trap already. They're obviously struggling already with their escalation trap. And actually, it is one of the hardest things to do as a parent, is to take a back step. And I think if you use that science, try and use that science model and see what the trap is that you're in. Write down what your goal is, and have a think about 4 or 5 ways in which you as a parent feel comfortable to take that back step, because it's going to be very difficult. So I'm trying to think of a situation where, for example, if you have, say the shouting that I mentioned earlier on, if you've got into the habit of raising your voice, and that you've noticed that the only time that your child actually is going to respond is when you've got to level 90 decibels or whatever it is, then try and see if you can just hold on. It's hard, but bite your tongue, bite your lip, and try and hold on when you get to about 30 decibels and watch what happens. Because often when I do this with parents, they always say, oh, nothing will happen because But because you're changing a habit, the shock of you not moving forward, actually the child sort of like, why isn't she getting any, what's happening to my mum? Makes a huge difference, huge difference. So that's what I mean about, if you get into a trap like that, try and think about how you could get out of it, but it is you that have to do that work, which is very difficult.
Wonderful. We have another question on how do we manage conversations about going out and staying safe in the light of the threat of increasing knife crime in Croydon?
That is a huge, huge problem, and it's a huge problem that we have. It's trying to see as much as possible, if you can, find, like, with my son, for example, like I say, I took the fishing to the extreme, and I ended up having to drive 30 miles sometimes to take him fishing, because I think that was one of the ways of keeping him away from going with the group and with the friends. So I used his hobby. I used his hobby as much as possible. And it meant that sometimes I had to sacrifice an awful lot of my time in order to do that. But it was the only way I could keep him away from the group. And he could meet the group for their birthday drinks and so on. But when it came to socializing, he wasn't there. So, for example, I do remember there was one incident when one of his friends got knocked down and killed, and he had got back home that night from fishing, and he was sleeping, and he got the phone call about 2 o'clock in the morning. And he said to me, he said, "Oh my God, I was planning to go out with you. I'm so glad I went fishing instead." And I think that's what I mean by have a good think about what could you as a parent do instead, and be prepared to make those sacrifices, because they are hard, I know, to do in this day and age.
Wonderful. We have another question, which is how to rebuild trust when things have gone wrong.
Oh, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. So I suppose we're talking about teenagers here, really, really late on, because trust is something you build from about age 3 or 4. And it's really hard when they get to teenage and they're not finding. I mean, it depends on what you mean by trust. Is it because you can't trust them, or they can't trust you? And I think that might sound harsh, but I don't mean it in a harsh way. I mean it in a sort of a really balanced way. And one of the, I'd like to try and give as many practical examples as possible. But one of the things that I mentioned earlier, just to give an example of, I remember getting on a bus at Clapham Common. I was on the bus, and the bus stopped, and there were about 9 young boys. They were all black boys waiting to get onto the bus. And there was also a lot of adults waiting to get on the bus. And the bus driver refused to open the door, and he wouldn't let them on. And I was sitting there, the adults were banging on the door saying, "Well, we've got to go home, we've got to go home." In the end, he drove off, didn't let anybody on. And when I got home, I mentioned this to my son, and he said, "That always happens." "What? What do you mean that always happens?" He said, "Yeah, it happens to me a lot." I thought, "What? You never said anything like this to me." And it's interesting, what I felt from that, what I took from that is when those boys got home, they would have their parents go about being late, about all sorts of things, and they won't believe what happened. Because I probably wouldn't have believed my son. And I think that even at teenage years, you have to really, really, really understand and appreciate what our young people are going through to rebuild that trust in them as well. Because you would have to trust that they're telling you the truth about what's actually happening to them out there. I think this whole thing with the knife crime as well, that's the whole situation as well. It's this, how do we help our young people to be able to talk to us about things? We've got to make that space, keep that door open, not ajar, open, so that they can feel that they can communicate with us. Because if they don't feel that they can tell us things, because when they tell us something, we don't believe them, then we don't gain their trust.
Great. We have another question, which is, Jenny, what happens if they don't have a hobby? I mean, you've talked a lot about hobbies and having healthy relationships and activities, but what if they're not interested?
Children always have something they're interested in, and we have to find that. Okay, we have to find it, and they will be interested in something. Now, I say that because a lot of parents will say to me, or always say to me, "Yeah, they're PlayStation." That's all they're interested in. PlayStation also has things like exercises and all sorts of things on them. You can use these facilities to do other things with your young people and see how that can grow into something else. And when you say they don't have a hobby, what are they good at in school? So if it is technology that is their best lesson, they could be a computer programmer. They could be a technology expert. What are they best at in school? If it is they're good at writing their essays in English, they could become part. You can encourage them and help them to think about how they could progress with that in a book club or a literature club or something like that. So I think that what you can do is help to nurture that hobby by looking at what they are best at and what they're good at, and help to encourage them to move forward. And I think that you'll find that that makes a difference to their lives.
Wonderful. We don't have any more questions.